economists who have learned economics but not thought that much about finance, I often get a powerful reaction because they think of the fiscal theory as a replacement for the monetarist theory. And before the recent crash, what I would say is both those theories hold as equilibrium conditions. These are two ways of looking at the same thing. But in the recent crash, the very definition of money has kind of fallen apart, whereas the fiscal theory still gives you a reasonable conceptual framework. Now, when you ask about what are the implications for current policy, the simplest version of the fiscal theory says, if you run big deficits and make nominal debt go up, and you don't do anything to make the future primary surpluses go up, the real value of the debt has to stay the same. So price level has to go up to devalue the debt you've issued. That's the simplest causal interpretation of the fiscal theory. But actually, if you look at Japan or the US today, there's very little evidence that rising deficits lead, at least quickly, to inflation. But you have to understand that rising deficits can have two kinds of effects. They, of course, increase the amount of nominal debt in people's hands, and if the price level doesn't change, it makes that debt seem worth more to them. And if they don't see any change in their future taxes, it makes them feel richer, they want to spend, that's inflation. But I think in the US today and in Japan, people read in the newspaper about deficits and debt, and an increase in deficits makes people think taxes are going to go up. Social Security won't be there when I retire. Medicare, what's going to happen to that? You certainly get that if you talk to young people in Japan. Actually, if I talk to my kids, who themselves have kids now, the way they're thinking, there's no notion in their minds that deficits are good news. Deficits to them are reasons to worry more about the future, save more. They actually may be contractionary in that situation. The relationship is the expected future deficits have to match the real value of the debt, but a current deficit can actually make expected future surpluses go up and by more than the amount of the debt. It depends on exactly how the debt issue is done. I think that deficits right now, in the absence of any political agreement about how we're going to handle our long-run deficit, so everybody's figuring who knows how they're going to do it. It's going to be slashes in some programs, but is it going to be the one that affects me or the one that affects the other guy, or is it all going to be taxes? People are very worried about that, and increased deficits have a negative effect there. But if we had an agreement where people can understand how, once growth gets going in the economy again, these trade-offs are going to be made, and people become confident that there are commitments that they can rely on about how much retirement benefit there's going to be, how much support for medical care for the elderly there are going to be, even if it's more restricted than what it's been. Once it's clear what it is, a deficit now would then be expansionary. Because it wouldn't make people think that the deficit now necessarily is connected to some crazy chaos in the future on the fiscal side. So I think the other problem with existing monetary policy models is that besides the fact that they haven't had financial sectors, they haven't had rich, detailed treatments of fiscal policy taking account of wealth effects. And actually, most central banks, I think, are putting much more emphasis on financial frictions, in other words, analyzing how we got here, than they are on doing the fiscal policy right, which is what I think we're going to need to understand as things go forward. Let me give you one insight that comes from the fiscal theory way of thinking. Every monetary policy reaction requires a fiscal policy reaction if it's going to be successful. We think of interest rate rises engineered by the Fed as anti-inflationary, as contractionary. But they are not contractionary unless the fiscal policy responds. And you can understand that now by asking what would happen if the Fed needed to push interest rates back up to what used to be considered normal levels, 5%. Right now, interest expense as a proportion of the federal budget is at historically normal levels, under 10%. But that's because interest rates are at historically very abnormal levels, around 1%. If interest rates went up to 5%, and over a fairly short span of time as the debt turned over, the interest expense proportion of the budget would go from 10% to 30, 35% because our debt is so big now. It's never been that high historically as a proportion of the budget. What would Congress do? What you hope they would do is they'd realize things are running off the rails. We've got to figure out how to get control over spending and taxes and get budgets back in line. But you could also imagine a counterproductive reaction. What is the Fed doing? This is another big error by Bernanke. He's causing us a lot of trouble. Let's fire the guys in the Fed and bring in somebody who's more accommodating. That's the worry about, it's not the Fed's balance sheet expansion that's the worry about long-run inflation. The worry is we've got a big debt. At some point, we're going to have to pay for it. And if paying for it is, the need to pay for it is somehow seen as brought on by the Fed, we could end up in a bad situation.
Let me ask the final question, I would guess. I would take that liberty. We talked this afternoon and asked Chris what he saw as being one or two of the major problems that the new administration or the current administration is going to have to deal with after the election. And you told us what, Chris?
I said there are too many candidates to pick one, but from an economist's point of view, getting control of the budget and the deficit is so easy. I mean, our tax rates are low by international standards. We wouldn't have to go to being high. We could just go to being normal by international standards with our tax rates to solve the whole deficit problem with taxes. We don't want to probably solve the whole problem with taxes. We'll probably want to do a little tax increase, some expenditure cuts. But if you just got a bunch of guys in the rooms who understood the budgets and said you can't come out until you've got an agreement or we'll shoot you, it could be done. It's not an economic problem. We have the institutions in this country who have the responsibility for solving this, and it's not a technically difficult problem to solve it. The real problems for the U.S., well, in Europe, they have a problem that there is no such, the institutions aren't there. They're having to invent them on the fly to do similar negotiations. The real problems for us are these issues of an aging population, increasing medical costs. The implicit debt is represented by commitments to retiring old people are much greater than the explicit market debt that people focus on. And this involves trade-off of the welfare of young people versus old people, questions about how much inequality in the conditions faced by old people we're going to tolerate. These are very hard political issues, political economic issues. Those are the real problems where economists don't have any quick answers. Economists have some quick answers to how we get control of the deficit. The hard problem is what do we do about these long-term fiscal problems and the trading off of interests of different population groups we have to do.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. Again, I want to thank you for coming on behalf of the Department of Economics, the Richard B. Johnson Center, and the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. Our meetings continue tomorrow, and we have a video of Chris this afternoon, and we hope to put that on the Richard B. Johnson site. We also hope to have this video up and running for people to look at and review and come to understand what the fiscal policy effects are on price. And it's a new way of looking at price determination, I think. So with further ado, we wish you a safe drive home and good night.